Sarsons once controlled 80% of the British vinegar market. Today, they're part of a duopoly that controls just 30% of a £318 million market they used to dominate alone. That's not a decline. That's a corporate death spiral hidden in plain sight. Here's how we accidentally executed them. In 1970, your family used 2.3 litres of vinegar per year. Today, just 0.8 litres. You went from eating fish and chips weekly to monthly. Sarsons survived everything history threw at them since 1794. 2 world wars, the Great Depression, the Beatles. But they couldn't survive you falling out of love with fish and chips. This is how your changing dinner habits slowly strangled Britain's vinegar king. I'm here to tell you about one of Britain's biggest failures. A brand that survived for centuries but slowly vanished from your life. And you never even noticed. This video will explain why your homemade fish and chips never taste right, and why that bottle of Sarsons in your cupboard is basically a museum piece. But here's what will really shock you. This isn't just about vinegar. It's about how you accidentally destroyed British food culture and took down a 200-year-old company in the process. Everyone talks about British brands dying, how Cadbury sold out, how Woolworths vanished. But Sarsons is different. They didn't collapse overnight. They didn't get stripped by private equity. Instead, something worse happened. Britain quietly stopped eating fish and chips the way you used to. And when a nation stops using vinegar every week, even the mightiest vinegar king becomes vulnerable. But wait, there's more to this story than you think. Sarson's story is your story. It's about how modern Britain lost touch with its own culture, and you never realised it was happening. How many Friday nights did you spend queuing at the chippy as a kid? How many times did your dad shake that brown bottle over hot chips wrapped in newspaper? That wasn't just dinner. It was British identity you could eat. And companies like Sarsons? They weren't just selling sauce. They were selling culture. They were the liquid version of British Friday nights. But culture breaks easily. Change your eating habits? You change everything. Stop visiting chippies? You don't just hurt the chippy owner, you hurt the vinegar company. The potato supplier, the newspaper wrapper, the whole system crumbles. That's what happened to Sarsons. They built an empire on British food culture. When that culture quietly died, so did their power. The accidental empire. It's 1794. Thomas Sarson is absolutely furious. He's been carting vinegar barrels around London for Champion Vinegar Works for years. Reliable as clockwork. Never missed a delivery. Then one day, boom, they fire him. No explanation. Just, we'll handle our own deliveries now. Most people would have found other work, maybe started carting for someone else. But Thomas Sarson? He decided to get revenge. Business revenge. Here's why this matters. In Georgian London, reputation was everything. If Champion Vinegar could dump reliable suppliers whenever they felt like it. What did that say about how they treated people? Thomas Sarson wasn't just angry about losing money. He was angry about being disrespected. So he used his life savings to rent a small brewery on Craven Street, practically next door to Champion Vinegar. And he started making his own vinegar. Better vinegar. The ultimate Victorian middle finger. He became everything Champion Vinegar wasn't. While Champion cut corners and added cheap chemicals, Sarsons refused to compromise. They took longer, cost more, but made pure vinegar. By 1884, Thomas Sarson's revenge project had become Sarsons Virgin Vinegar. And that name wasn't just marketing, it was a declaration of war against the entire vinegar industry. Here's what you need to know about Victorian food. Everything was fake. Bread had chalk in it. Milk was watered down. And vinegar? Most vinegar makers added acid to speed things up. They pumped in brown colouring to make it look expensive. They cut every corner possible, but not Sarsons. They called it virgin vinegar because their product was literally untouched by chemicals. pure and clean when everyone else was cheating. This wasn't just about making vinegar. This was about making a statement. Sarsons was saying, "We refuse to poison our customers for profit," in an age when that was revolutionary thinking. And it worked. By 1893, they were making over 1 million gallons a year from their massive factory in Bermondsey. You could smell it from Tower Bridge, the aroma of quality drifting across the Thames. By 1940, Sarsons had accidentally created a monopoly, not through aggressive takeovers, not through dirty tricks, but through pure survival. In 1920, Britain had 65 vinegar breweries. 65 family businesses scattered across the country, each serving their local communities. By 1940, Sarsons had basically taken over them all. Here's the crazy part. They hadn't driven the others out of business. The others had simply merged, been bought, or quietly disappeared. And nobody noticed, because Sarsons was so good at being everywhere. Remember your nan's kitchen in the 1980s? She had 3 bottles on the counter: HP sauce, Worcestershire sauce, and Sarsons vinegar. The holy trinity of British flavour. But your nan didn't choose Sarsons because of clever marketing. She chose it because it was practically the only choice. The local vinegar makers her mother might have used, gone. The regional brands from the 1950s vanished. Sarsons had won by being the last one standing, and for 40 years, from 1940 to 1980, they enjoyed market control that would make Google jealous. The slogan said it all. Don't say vinegar, say Sarsons. Because by the 1970s, they were the same thing. Every fish and chip shop, every household, every pub, they all had the same brown bottle. Sarsons had achieved the ultimate business dream. They'd become so essential to British life that people couldn't imagine the country without them. Their product was on every table, in every cupboard, part of the DNA of British food culture. But here's what they didn't see coming. While they were perfecting their recipe and celebrating their success, the foundation of their entire business was starting to crack. Because in the 1980s, something fundamental changed about how Britain ate. And when a nation changes its eating habits, even the mightiest monopoly becomes vulnerable, especially when your entire business depends on one simple ritual: the weekly visit to the fish and chip shop. The golden age built on chips. Sarson's golden age was built entirely on Britain's obsession with fish and chips. In the 1950s and 60s, Friday night meant one thing for most British families: queuing at the local chippy. This wasn't just fast food. It was a social ritual that crossed every class boundary in Britain. Families didn't eat out at restaurants like you do today. They ate out at chippies, and every single visit meant vinegar. Lots of it. And here's how this created Sarson's empire. That weekly chip shop visit was the gateway drug to vinegar in every other part of British life. If you used vinegar on chips every Friday, you started using it for pickling vegetables, for cleaning windows, for treating everything from jellyfish stings to head lice. The chippy created a vinegar habit that spilled into every corner of British home life. In 1968, when Sarsons moved to their massive site in Middleton, they were making over 5 million gallons annually. That's enough to fill 2 Olympic swimming pools. Every year. Where was all this vinegar going? Chip shops were the biggest users, obviously, but households were buying it by the bottle. Pubs stocked it for their fish and chips. Even school canteens had Sarsons bottles on every table. This wasn't just a product, it was infrastructure. Sarsons vinegar was as essential to British food culture as salt or pepper. Stop. I need you to understand something crucial here. Sarsons' entire business depended on one simple assumption: that British people would keep eating fish and chips the way they always had. And for 40 years, from 1940 to 1980, that seemed like the safest bet in the world. Fish and chips wasn't just popular, it was cultural identity in edible form. It was what made Britain, Britain. By 1980, Sarsons looked bulletproof. They controlled roughly 4/5 of the British malt vinegar market. Their teardrop bottle was instantly recognisable. Their Middleton factory employed hundreds of people. They were profitable, growing, and seemed as permanent as Big Ben. But underneath, cracks were starting to show, and here's what was happening that nobody paid attention to. Immigration was changing British food culture. Indian restaurants were multiplying across the country. Chinese takeaways were opening on every high street. Pizza was arriving from America. For the first time in generations, British families had choices on Friday night. Real choices. Not just which chippy to visit, but whether to visit a chippy at all. Remember when your family's Friday routine changed? Maybe you were 12 or 13. Your dad came home from work. Instead of saying, "Fancy fish and chips," he said, "Fancy a curry." In 1980, there were 11,500 across Britain. By 2000, down to 10,500. By 2020, fewer than 9,500. That's 2,000 businesses that disappeared while you weren't paying attention. But other takeaways were exploding. Indian restaurants went from 3,000 in 1980 to over 12,000 by 2000. Chinese takeaways doubled. Pizza shops exploded from virtually nothing to thousands. Here's what this meant for vinegar sales. When you eat curry, you don't use vinegar. When you eat pizza, you don't use vinegar. When you eat sushi, you definitely don't use vinegar. Sarsons experienced a slow, steady erosion as British families discovered there was more to Friday night than fish and chips. Sarsons' core market was being eaten alive by foreign food, and they didn't even realise it was happening. How could they? They were still selling millions of gallons of vinegar. Chip shops were still ordering by the case. The numbers looked fine. But numbers can lie, especially when they're measuring the past instead of predicting the future. While there was a change in British Friday night culture, something else was starting to happen that would also impact Sarsons' control. Something was stirring in the health food shops of California. The wellness revolution was coming, and it would transform vinegar from a simple source into a superfood supplement. The question was, would Sarsons be ready for it? Spoiler alert, they weren't. The health revolution. Sarsons missed. While Sarsons was perfecting their traditional malt vinegar in Middleton, two revolutions were happening at the same time. Apple cider vinegar was becoming a wellness product, and Britain was falling out of love with fish and chips. The 1990s brought something new to British culture: health consciousness. Suddenly, people cared about what they put in their bodies. Fat was the enemy, carbs were suspicious, and anything natural was automatically good. Apple cider vinegar fitted this story perfectly. It wasn't just a sauce, it was medicine you could buy without a prescription. Weight loss, blood sugar control, better digestion, clearer skin. The claims kept mounting. The health food revolution was creating a completely new vinegar market, and Sarsons was nowhere near it. Apple cider vinegar captured the public imagination. It started with celebrity endorsements. Then came the Instagram influencers. Soon, everyone was posting photos of their morning ACV shots, claiming miraculous health benefits. The numbers are staggering. Apple cider vinegar, which barely existed in British homes 20 years ago, now holds 24% of the UK's £318 million vinegar market. That's over £76 million in annual sales, for a product that barely existed in British households 20 years ago. But here's the really painful part. The UK vinegar market overall is actually growing at 7.3% annually. Vinegar as a category is booming. It's just booming around Sarsons, not because of them. Think about this. Your daughter probably spends £8 a bottle on organic apple cider vinegar from Whole Foods, but she's never bought malt vinegar in her life. Ask her why. She'll reel off a list of health benefits. Then she'll probably add, "Malt vinegar is what old people put on chips." That one sentence explains Sarsons' entire problem. They'd become associated with old-fashioned British food. In a generation that was actively rejecting old-fashioned British food, Sarsons hadn't failed to innovate. They'd failed to realise that innovation was necessary. They thought they were in the vinegar business. But they were actually in the Friday night fish and chips business. And that business was dying. Let me break down the math of Sarsons' decline. In 1980, the average British person ate fish and chips once a week. That's 52 vinegar-using occasions per year. By 2020, once a month. That's 12 occasions per year. Sarsons lost 77% of their usage occasions without a single customer actively deciding to boycott them. Meanwhile, those same people were buying enough apple cider vinegar to bathe in. The market hadn't shrunk. It had moved. And Sarsons was still standing in the old location, wondering where everyone had gone. But if you think the apple cider vinegar revolution was the worst thing to happen to Sarsons, you're wrong. Because while they were dealing with changing customer preferences, they were about to discover a betrayal so fundamental it strikes at the heart of British culture itself. The fish and chip shops that still existed, Sarsons' core customers, were about to abandon them too. Not for a competitor, but for something so cheap and fake it legally couldn't even be called vinegar. The great chip shop deception was about to be exposed, and it would reveal that most British people had been eating fake vinegar for decades without knowing it, including you. The great chip shop deception. In 2017, a YouTuber named Tom Scott uploaded a video that changed everything. The title was simple: The Fake Vinegar in British Fish and Chip Shops. It got 3.9 million views and broke a lot of hearts. Here's what he revealed. That brown liquid in those plastic bottles at your local chippy? It's not vinegar. It's something called non-brewed condiment. Basically water mixed with acid, brown colouring and flavourings. No fermentation, no brewing, no malt, just chemistry. The reaction was immediate and brutal. The comments filled with people saying, "That explains why I could never recreate chip shop taste at home," and "My whole life has been a lie." But here's what's really shocking. Non-brewed condiment isn't new. It's been around since at least 1921. That's over a century of fake vinegar. Here's why it was created. Real malt vinegar takes time to brew. You need barley, fermentation tanks, aging processes. It costs money and requires skill. Non-brewed condiment can be made in a factory in hours, not months. And here's what happened legally. In 1949, the courts ruled that non-brewed condiment couldn't legally be called vinegar. Hence the fancy name, non-brewed condiment. But most chip shops simply ignored the labelling rules. How did they get away with it? Because trading standards couldn't police every chip shop in Britain, and because most customers never asked what was in those unmarked plastic bottles behind the counter. Let me give you numbers that explain everything. A 5-litre bottle of non-brewed condiment costs under £1. One bottle of real malt vinegar costs over £2. For a struggling chip shop watching customers disappear to curry houses and pizza places, that's not a choice, it's survival. Here's the mind-blowing moment. An entire generation of British people had grown up thinking fake vinegar was the authentic British experience. They'd been tricked into nostalgia for a chemical substitute. Want proof? Buy both real malt vinegar and non-brewed condiment. Try them side by side on chips. You know what you'll find? The fake stuff tastes more like your childhood memories of chip shops. That's when you realise the full horror of what happened. Sarsons had spent 200 years perfecting real malt vinegar, but a generation of Brits had learned to love fake vinegar instead. When they tried to recreate chip shop taste at home with real Sarsons vinegar, it disappointed them. Sarsons was competing with childhood memories of a chemical substitute. Think about what this means for British food culture. For decades, your most iconic national dish has been served with fake sauce. Fish and chips with non-brewed condiment. It's like discovering that tea bags contain fake tea leaves, or that HP sauce is actually made in a laboratory. Most people didn't care when they found out. The response wasn't outrage, it was, well, it tastes better anyway. So where does this leave Sarsons in 2025? They're still making 6 million litres of real malt vinegar annually. They're still the UK's leading malt vinegar brand. But they're the king of a kingdom that's been hollowed out from the inside. Their core market, chip shops, had largely abandoned them for cheaper alternatives. Their potential new market, health-conscious consumers, had moved to apple cider vinegar. And their nostalgic appeal was based on memories of fake vinegar that competed with their authentic product. Sarsons faced the ultimate business nightmare, being too authentic for their traditional market and too traditional for their potential new market. The question was, could they adapt? Or were they doomed to become a nostalgic footnote in British food history? The Survivor's Dilemma. Today, Sarsons is owned by Mizkan, a 200-year-old Japanese vinegar company that bought the brand for £41 million in 2012. They're investing £17 million in the Middleton facility and still make 6 million litres of vinegar annually. By any measure, this is a successful business. Sarsons remains the UK's leading malt vinegar brand. But being the leading malt vinegar brand in 2025 is like being the world's best typewriter maker in 1995. Walk into any Tesco and you'll see the story told in shelf space. The malt vinegar section, dominated by Sarsons, takes up maybe 2 feet of shelf space, tucked away near the pickles. Meanwhile, the apple cider vinegar section stretches for yards in the health food aisle. Organic options, flavoured varieties, with mother formulations that cost 10 times as much as malt vinegar. Brands that didn't exist 20 years ago now outsell Britain's oldest vinegar company. The ritual that built Sarsons' empire, the weekly chip shop visit, has become a monthly nostalgia trip at best. Today's generation gets their Friday night fix from Uber Eats, not the local chippy. They Instagram their avocado toast with balsamic drizzle, not their fish and chips with malt vinegar. So here's the question that keeps me thinking. Could Sarsons have adapted? Should they have seen this coming? On one hand, they had 200 years of heritage and brand recognition. They could have used that for health products, premium positioning, or international expansion. On the other hand, they were a family business that had been bought and sold multiple times. They'd survived by being conservative, traditional, consistent. Innovation might have killed them faster than staying the same, which brings us to the uncomfortable truth about modern Britain. You destroyed Sarsons' empire not through boycotts or protests, but through multiple small decisions. Curry instead of chips, Deliveroo instead of the chippy, apple cider vinegar instead of malt. Each decision seemed tiny, but together they dismantled a business model that had worked for 2 centuries. The question is, was this progress or loss? Did you gain something valuable by diversifying your food culture? Or did you accidentally throw away something irreplaceable? The story of Sarsons isn't really about vinegar. It's about how the death of British food traditions can slowly strangle even the most successful British brands. The weekly chippy run, the Friday night queue, the ritual of salt and vinegar on newspaper-wrapped chips. If this story interests you, hit that subscribe button as I've got more tales about the demise of once iconic brands. And let me know in the comments, do you still buy Sarsons vinegar and visit your local fish and chip shop? Next week, I'm diving into another British food tradition that's hiding its slow death in plain sight.